looking back 8 years, I don't know how that guy made it at all, because he lacked a lot of skills. There was so much he did not know about writing that I don't know how he figured it out. I don't know how he survived until he figured it out. Because I do it a lot better now, even from the business side, but then also just in terms of story creation. Some of it was just figuring out how to write, like how to tell a story well. And the only way to get there is to write badly long enough that you figure out what's bad and then how to make it good.
Hey, it's Ryan, and welcome to The Prolific Creator, where we reflect on life and art and see what sticks. And today, my friends, I'm so excited to talk to Jay Wilburn. Jay is a full-time writer in South Carolina. He is a prolific writer of horror and speculative fiction. He is a great human. He is a man of faith. And also in 2017, he had a life-changing kidney transplant that has literally kept him alive. That's why we call him Captain 3 Kidneys. Jay has been a friend for a long time. He's a podcaster, he's a YouTuber, he does all kinds of stuff. And I'm so excited to share this interview with you. We talk about calling into creative work. How do we know what we're supposed to be doing with our lives? We talk about faith. We talk about writing with health issues, how to work through that. And Jay has been a great inspiration to me over the years, just as he's dealt with a lot of things in his life and how he's navigated those things, how he works through those things. And we talk a lot about that. This is just an action-packed interview, and I'm excited to share this with you today on The Prolific Creator. Now, one thing I do have to say before I share this interview with you is this was recorded, and this interview took place on an old podcast project that didn't really go anywhere. But it was such a good interview I wanted to share with you because I feel like it fits really well with this community and the people that enjoy this show and the things we're trying to create. So if you hear references to the old podcast, Common Grace Project, or other things, don't be alarmed. That's just what that is. But you're going to really enjoy me chatting with prolific creator, prolific writer, Jay Wilburn. So enjoy our chat. Well, hey, welcome everyone. So excited today to have Jay Wilburn on the show, author, writer, and just an overall good human. So, hey, Jay, thanks for coming on the show. Hey,
thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, Jay is a can we say friends? I know,
we're friends.
We've never met in person, but if you're Twitter friends or, you've interviewed each other, I think you count as friends, right?
Yeah, we're friends. We're friends.
Yeah. And I love Jay, love what he's doing as far as writing, and so glad to have him on the show again. And I know we had him on the show for the Prolific Writer, but now he's on the Common Grace Project. And so looking forward to hearing his perspectives on faith and writing and all that good stuff. And Jay, I really always appreciated just your angle. You have your own podcast, the Faith Matters podcast, and just your wisdom, your thoughts on writing in general, but also faith and things like that. And I want to just open our time and just ask you, why do you write? You started about 8 years ago full time, but what
right.
kind of was your impetus to just go for it?
Well, I started writing badly when I was a kid. So like many people do, I was, doing imitations of J.R.R. Tolkien stuff, and then later imitations of the sci-fi writers I liked. I really didn't get into horror much until high school. I always thought of it as something that wasn't for me necessarily. It wasn't really a faith thing. It was just, my predispositions about what horror was. And then I connected to Stephen King about halfway through high school and started reading a lot of his stuff, and then kind of graduated into other horror later. Zombies were really the thing that kind of got me in. So it was more of like an apocalyptic connection than it was specifically horror that got me writing. And so Stephen King's The Stand really connected with me and altered the way I just thought about the universe and the world. And then zombie movies I really enjoyed for the same reasons. So when I was originally writing, and the first short story I was actually paid for, these were zombie stories, and I kind of expanded into other areas after that, writing steampunk and writing other things like that. But it was kind of like a dream deferred sort of thing, I guess. For much of my adult life, I kind of set writing aside, and I enjoyed reading, and just kind of went along with jobs I didn't enjoy anymore and that kind of thing. And once I started, dabbling in writing again and making money at it, it sort of awakened like what my life was always supposed to be about. I think like what I was meant to do. The way my brain was hardwired to operate, it was like all of that was reawakened. And then being able to go full time with it was kind of a confirmation of really just seeking my life's purpose, whether you take that as a faith-based message or even just a secular idea of like being true to who you are.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that's an important piece of kind of distinguishing, what we're supposed to do. Maybe there is one thing, maybe there's multiple things, maybe there's, how many writers do we know that, even myself, I mean, I have other income. I don't have to solely rely on my writing income, but,
Mm-hmm.
They do it, and they do it on the side, and they do it well, and they wouldn't stop doing it even if they didn't make a nickel doing it.
Right.
And it's actually something I'd love to explore with you a little further as far as, calling and vocation, and how do you know, what I'm supposed to do. Maybe it is writing, maybe it's not, but how do you kind of figure that out? Sometimes it's opportunity, sometimes it's just luck, sometimes it's prayer, sometimes it's, direct, heard a voice in your head, whatever it is. But I wanted to kind of attack that a little bit. I loved your article. You did kind of a fun thing where you wrote an article about 7 or 8 years ago, kind of your journey into full-time writing, I think on Lit
Mm-hmm.
Reactor. And then you kind of revisited that, which I thought was fun. You can go check it out. I'll put it in the show notes.
Okay.
Jay's video on that. And just kind of reflecting back 8 years later, saying, okay, what have I learned, as far as going full-time as a writer and, how it began and things like that. So give us just a little like Cliff Notes version of what kind of led you, kind of taking the full leap into full-time writing, and what were the kind of circumstances, and also just some of the things you've kind of learned along the way.
Okay. I really had no excuse to do it. So like all the metrics that would say this is a good idea, I had none of that. So like every accomplishment that I could put down as a resume item and say, okay, this justifies going full-time, all that stuff came after. So I really had no good plan, and nobody that was in my situation should have done it, but I did it anyway, and it worked. The impetus of it being able to quit my teaching job was that my second son had started having seizures. He was only 1 or 2 years old at the time. And we couldn't get him to stop. So we were constantly in the hospital. Every time he got a fever, he had a seizure. And so anytime he was sick, we had to take him out of daycare and keep him at home and watch him. My wife and I both burned up all our sick days. So every time I had to be away from work, it was costing a lot of money. So I was actually basically losing money by working full time. And then after all my sick days were gone, I got sick. And whatever I caught, whether it was the flu or something else, I was down for days. And so we were getting to the point of not being able to pay bills situation. A lot of people stepped forward in that moment and helped us out. It was right close to Christmas. And so we moved on into the new year, 2013. And then it was around January, it was the same thing, still having to take days off to keep him well. And I really wasn't enjoying teaching anymore. I think I was good at it. I think there's enough students and parents that say I'm good at it that I could probably make the case. But I always made the joke that I really love teaching, and I would have loved to have had an opportunity to do it, when you're done with paperwork and everything else you had to get done. So I debated it, and we were going to have to put him on medication. And ironically, I'm actually on seizure medication now for some of the stuff that's happened to me. And I can tell sort of the mental drain that comes down on it, kind of like you're at the bottom of the ocean at different times. I think I fake it pretty well. But it does take a mental toll in addition to the transplant meds I'm on. And all that stuff is a known quantity. And with him only being 1 and 2, the idea of putting him on the seizure medications and then having that be the defining factor of his development, I didn't like that at all. But he couldn't stop having fevers because, of course, he was going to daycare. So with the money we were losing and with the price of daycare and a bunch of other factors, I presented it to my wife that I would quit my job, stay home with them, make a go at making money, whatever avenues I could find with writing, and just get him past that, get him to the age where febrile seizures weren't an issue anymore. So him being sick was the excuse, but I really didn't want to teach anymore. Mm-hmm. And the idea that I gave my wife was, in a year I can go back to teaching. But I knew at that point I didn't want to go back. I was going to do anything to not go back. And then as time went on, we found I sort of diversified my writing and found ways to make it work and that sort of thing. And the further I went on, it kind of became a game of throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what stuck, and then being more sophisticated with that idea as I went on. It was kind of trying to find the things other people hadn't tried yet and get to it first and see if you could do something with it. And that still kind of defines where I am with my writing career at this point. And some of those things work, and I was able to make a living. I've reached sort of a point where I'm pretty much consistently make better money than I did when I was teaching. It's not nearly as consistent, obviously, but I guess that's a big marker of success when it comes to the writing world.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that's really helpful because I think obviously your story is very unique, and you've had some, external circumstances and, family situations that were, whether it forced you into writing or not, or maybe that was, kind of God's way of kind of bringing all those things together, using a hard thing to mm-hmm. say, hey, this is maybe what you're called to do in a way to provide for your family. And I love that because I think people need to hear that those that would think about, maybe I'm called to write, maybe I'm called to a different job, but sometimes we're always looking for that formula. It's got to mm-hmm. be, do A, B, and C, and then
right.
obvious. But really, everybody's story is different in how they get into it and how they're sustained by it. So, when you think about writing, I mean, you said when you were a kid and you're dabbling here and there, and you started reading and then really finding kind of your voice and things. When you come to the page now, and when you were kind of forced into, and maybe that's a strong language. I mean, it sounds like you're kind of forced into, I got to provide for my family somehow. Mm-hmm. I'm doing this full time. I'm not teaching anymore. Where did you begin? I mean, what did like day one, week one, month one look like? I mean, was it, I had a book idea, I needed to write articles for $5 an article? I mean, what was kind of the strategy, if you had any?
Looking back 8 years, I don't know how that guy made it at all, because he lacked a lot of skills. There was so much he did not know about writing that I don't know how he figured it out. I don't know how he survived until he figured it out. Because I do it a lot better now, even from the business side, but then also just in terms of story creation. Some of it was just figuring out how to write, like how to tell a story well. And the only way to get there is to write badly long enough that you figure out what's bad and then how to make it good. And I do also think that there's an element of sort of that raw talent, that sort of a core to you that I think is more exposed when you first begin, when you have no idea how to put sentences together right, or what's going to drive an editor crazy about your work when you're just writing because you're driven to in the beginning. You don't know what makes a story marketable, any of that stuff. I think that raw element of what makes a writer is more exposed at that point. And then as you kind of become better at the job, you become more refined in the way you tell stories. You figure out what doesn't work, what's cliche, what hasn't been done. But then you risk, I think, losing that raw bit of storytelling that you may have had at the beginning, and some of your stories can actually become kind of sated. And I kind of feel like I was struggling with that maybe midway through my full-time writing career, realizing I would look back at old stories and it would be a combination of two things. One thing would be that I couldn't believe I was writing that badly and sending that to editors. That was embarrassing. Mm-hmm. But the second part was that some of those stories just had a raw drive to them that some of the stories I was writing at that moment kind of lacked, and it bothered me. It bothered me that maybe in trying to make a story perfect, I'd lost something in just the abandonment of writing. And so as I've kind of gotten to a point now, I think I have a pretty good balance of that. I'm not perfect on the form side, and I'm not perfect on just the raw emotional side, but I think I've developed both to where I can consistently write a decent story, not one that may land with every publisher, but one that I can look at and say, okay, when somebody reads this, they're going to see that I know what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. No, and it sounds like you think of a craft for any job, you just get better at your craft. I mean, the more you do it. And I think it's that 10,000, hour rule. It's
Right.
It's by doing. It's, the Beatles played, these little basement shows for, years before they ever were discovered. And it's like, yeah, they learned how to play together. And,
Right.
Tiger Woods, and you think of, he hit a lot of golf balls before he, won a major. And, and it's like, as much as we want this magic pill or this magic formula, it's, it's kind of like what Stephen King says, right? It's read a lot, write a lot. I mean, there's not a whole lot in between. And you begin to kind of develop a taste. I think even in yourself, you can even though we say we're the worst critics of our own work, you kind of know what's good storytelling, good writing, and what's not.
Yeah.
Even when your own stuff's not up to par, because I think you get feedback from editors, you get feedback from readers, and you go, hey, this doesn't work, or why do you do this, or why do you repetitively, do these things? I have the same thing with my editors. It's like the same, marks on the thing. Don't do that. That's not good. Whatever it is. So I think that's, when we think about, and I think, sometimes in the calling piece, we act as if we're called to something, we're good at something, that it's just going to be easy. It's just going to come easy. Like, we don't have to work at it anymore. We don't, it's ours, and we just do it. And it's just, magic writing fairies that come down on our shoulders. And,
right.
But like you said, you've had health conditions, health problems, and that's a factor, and time and family and money and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes you just have to write the thing because you need to pay the bills, right?
Yeah.
So I'd love to explore that a little bit as far as, I know you mentioned it. People might not know, but you had a kidney transplant because you are Captain 3 Kidney, and affectionately known. And I love that part of your story, because I think part of you didn't really share it specifically, and I could be wrong, but I think you part of it was you didn't know how long you'd have to live, and so writing was, hey, I really want to do this, and maybe I might not be around that long. Maybe I should consider this, and that's a real thing. So talk us through that, just as far as what is it like to deal with suffering, pain, health conditions, health problems, health issues, as you're a writer, and kind of balancing that? What does that look like in kind of your world, and, still needing to pay the bills, all those kinds of things?
Well, I had polycystic kidney disease. I guess I still have it. It's a genetic disorder, and it's what killed my grandmother, my father, and my brother. All three of them died from it. My aunt and one of my uncles have both also been transplanted. They had polycystic kidney disease, and they got transplants in time to where they didn't just deteriorate away on dialysis. Fortunately, I never had to go on dialysis. I had a live donor, and if I hadn't had a live donor at the time that I would have gone on dialysis, because I was nearly at full kidney failure. So a couple months more of not being on dialysis, I probably would have died. But because I had the live donor lined up, they went ahead and lined up the surgery and kind of brought me back from the brink at that point. So it was an ongoing deteriorating condition. I kind of describe it like dying in slow motion, where just gradually my energy level goes down. You constantly get blood tests and see how low your kidney function is and how high your creatinine number is, and you get to a certain number and you're liable to fall into a coma. You get down to a certain kidney function, and you're either going on dialysis or dying. So that sort of defined my life in a good way, not just when I was full-time, but even before that. But of course, it declined as you went along. When I was teaching, I kind of knew that I wasn't going to make it to retirement. It was just sort of one of those givens that, at the age that my father died, the age that my brother died, that just chances were, even if I went on dialysis, that I was just going to die in the classroom. So, I had this, the retirement plan kicks in at whatever age, but I wasn't ever going to make that. I was just going to work and earn money for my family, and then die doing something I didn't like. So I sort of was just plodding through at that point. Once I was writing full time, there's still this desperation of trying to make just enough money to pay the bills and then repeat again next month. But it was better than teaching. And for writing, in a sense, there was sort of this desperation of like, okay, I don't have as many years left. So do I actually care about what I'm writing now? Is there anything I want to write before I go? And of course, what I want to write before I go will always be bigger than your life, even if you're a quite healthy individual, I think. And then it kind of reached a point where we started looking at kidney transplant. And so even then it was not a guarantee that I was going to make it or any of that kind of stuff. And so you're kind of preparing for the surgery, knowing that, while it's, death isn't the most likely outcome, it's a possibility. And so you're kind of setting up for what's going to be going on in your family. Then on the other side of transplants, it feels like a different world. Like I could taste food in a way that I didn't realize I wasn't doing before. I could breathe better. I wasn't cold all the time like I had been. And of course, you're recovering from a major, major surgery. So you got that going on, but it's still so much better than full kidney failure that you almost feel like a different person at that point. And it opened up a different life. Now, again, live donor kidney transplant, the average is around 13 years. So like if I can keep my weight down, I may get a little more time. If I'm not compliant with my medicine, I'll get a lot less time. If I keep my blood pressure down, I'll get more time. So there's always this game to it. And so now I'm 4 years in, so I'm looking at, somewhere around 9 years or more before we go back into that. So that kind of defines my life in a different way. I don't quite look at it as, I desperately need to get all this stuff done. I just kind of get up thankful that I have a day to do X, Y, or Z. I'll get it done or I won't. And there will be a point where I'm done and there'll be some unfinished work. I mean, that's just a given. But I kind of, when I'm exercising or when I am doing anything else, I kind of, when I don't feel motivated, which just kind of happened a lot with the pandemic in terms of exercise, my go-to is, okay, is 9 years enough for you or do you want more? And when I don't feel motivated, I can sometimes drive myself to try harder from that. When I was in full kidney failure and my primary income at that point was ghostwriting, I was writing 10 and 12,000 words a day at the same time that I was, urinating blood and had trouble staying awake and things like that. After transplant, a lot of the meds I'm on, and especially when I had to go on the seizure med, I got some real mental blocks. So I have a bunch of things that I can't do, a bunch of things that I can't learn just because my brain won't process it. And so I have to do workarounds with that. So I write a lot less than that in a day now, even though I'm by all measures healthier. But it's just sort of like that's the new reality. So either I'll get everything done I want to do in a day, or I get up tomorrow and I'll get everything done I can possibly do in that day. And I think even though maybe my situation's more extreme than a lot of people's, I don't think it's that different. I think it's the same in different ways. So everybody has a thing. Everybody has a thing that's hanging on. There's nobody that's perfectly healthy. There's nobody that's in a perfect mental state. There's nobody that's in a perfect life. So whereas mine may make a better story, it's not comparative suffering. So it's not like someone else's life is just blossoming so much better, so they should accomplish more. They're struggling with things too, and it may just not be as obvious. But I think as writers, we all have the barriers, and we have to decide: are we going to let them be stop signs, or are we going to find our way around them?
No, I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you're saying. I mean, the psalmists talk about that, give us a heart of wisdom, help us count our days. It's nobody's guaranteed tomorrow, whether you have bad kidneys or good kidneys, and that's, I think for all of us, it's, what is my life work? What do I want to contribute? What's the good I want to do? And whether it's through storytelling or taking care of kids or teaching or what have you. And yet it's, like you said, it's not, comparative, but it's like, yeah, we're all, I mean, I can't sit here and go, 50 years from now, I'll be writing away. It's like, maybe not.
Right.
Most likely not, but who knows? But I thank you for sharing that part of your story, because I think there are a lot of, put writing aside, people that are just working jobs, living their lives with chronic pain, fatigue, struggle,
right.
And yet feel like I have, something to contribute, and I want to contribute, and finding ways to do that regardless. Because I think we're always looking for when I'm healthy enough, when I have the time, when I have the
right.
money, when I have the fill in the blank, when I marry the right person or, find the right friends, then I'll do X, Y, Z. And you realize there's really no better time than now. There's no better time than, and sometimes you have to kind of dip your toe in that. I think that's part of faith too. It's like, hey, the kid, we got to take care of my kid. We don't have the money, but hey, who knows? I mean, you could have every, situation lined up and it could totally fail too. So it's not like, oh, every opportunity is available to us. Everything's gonna go great. My health's great. But yeah, that could be gone tomorrow too. So thanks for sharing that part of your story. Let me talk about this. We both have an affection, an affinity for Mr. Stephen King, and I've always appreciated some of the things you've written about his books and the influence he's had on you. But I'm always curious, those that do enjoy his work, because I would say for me, I've said this many times publicly, is I actually have enjoyed a lot more of his horror stuff. I think some of the great stories, The Body and Shawshank and I do love The Stand, and I love, The Shining and all those great stories. But he's written he's so versatile. And I think some of his, he tells this great story. I remember hearing that story where he's like in Florida and he, was in the grocery store. And an old lady walks up to him and says, you're that guy, that, writes those, scary books or whatever. And, she says, the book I really like is that Green Mile, and he's like, I wrote that book. She's like, no, you didn't, that kind of thing. So I think it's just his versatility in writing, but there's something about, him that people are maybe scared of because of the horror part of it. Even people of faith, it's like, well, it's too graphic or too this or that. But from your perspective, what kind of always drew you to his writing and his stories, and what was it about it that kind of brought you in?
The first book I ever read by Stephen King was It, which is a pretty heavy horror book. There's some rough stuff in there. Mm-hmm. And I read it in high school, and it was, looking back on it now, having read it again recently, there's a lot of stuff that if another author tried to write it, an editor wouldn't let him get away with it. There's a lot of broken writing craft rules in there, not the least of which being some of the length and 1,000 pages, tangents and things like that. But it actually kind of was the length and the tangents that kind of drew me as a reader, like the things that were kind of side to the story and following the characters and caring about the characters and things like that. There's just something that fascinated me about it, and it almost had less to do with the horror and more to do with just the storytelling, the voice, and kind of looking and saying, "Oh, this is possible in writing." And I've kind of felt that way again more recently being, I guess, in the last 10 years when I started exploring more of indie writing, where the stories still kind of go through gatekeepers, but not the same ones that run the big presses, and you kind of see, oh, this is what's possible. Like if someone's allowed to just tell whatever story they want, break whatever rules they want, they could do this. I've been rereading all Stephen King's books in order, and I'm hoping to finish by the end of this year, although that's still going to be kind of a steep order, especially if he keeps writing.
Right.
But reading all his books back to back, it points out all the flaws. So like everything that he does wrong kind of stands out when you read the books back to back in order, because you can kind of see a bad habit play out over 3 or 4 books and they kind of drift away and another bad habit comes in. But it also shows some differences. I didn't realize that I didn't know what cosmic horror was when I was first reading Stephen King, and until I started rereading him, I didn't realize how big of an influence that was on his style of horror. I also didn't realize how big of a crime fiction writer he was, and a good bit of his crime fiction has supernatural elements, but not all of it. And there's more of it there. And eventually, I'm going to write an article about the best lesser known Stephen King novels. So like if Stephen King wasn't Stephen King and people didn't know who he was, there's a handful of novels that most people don't think about that I think might be considered his best. And so there's just a bunch of little side stories there that if he wasn't the author of The Shining and The Stand and the big novels like that, these would be the ones that jump out. Yeah. So there's a lot more depth to what he does that really has nothing to do with horror, just the ability to tell a story. And I do have to admit my own bias. I'm very forgiving of a Stephen King story, so a lot of stuff I might not put up with from other authors, I just embrace from him, and will take anything that he writes.
Yeah, I think a good example of you're saying stories that maybe people don't I think are brilliant is like The Long Walk, which is he wrote under a pseudonym, Bachman or
Right.
Richard Bachman. That book is just brilliant. I mean, just as a piece of literature, it's amazing. I mean, it's like one storyline that is expanded. It's a short novel, but the emotion in that story and the way he taps into kind of the everyday relatability of life, being a kid, being, in a family, work, all those kinds of things, I think resonates with a lot of people. And I think that's why he probably sells millions of copies too, is he really does write kind of an everyday man, everyday woman kind of story, right? It's small town. It's just relatable. And, and it's funny because when you get in it, it's not every page is someone's getting killed or there's blood.
Right.
It's like, it's about trauma and abuse and pain and what it's like growing up, and I think that's why I always resonated too. When I saw Stand By Me as a kid, I mean, I was in and I was like, wait, this is a Stephen King book, like a short story. And
right.
I read that and I go, this is about growing up, whether you grew up in the 50s or 80s or 90s or whatever. And it's just relatable. I've always just appreciated that. And I think we've talked about it too, just the spiritual themes that he deals with, faith and doubt and good and evil. It just runs through so many of his books. What's your opinion on, maybe not as, he sells a lot of books, but did you read Revival? Happen to read Revival?
I haven't gotten to that one yet.
Yeah. It's fairly new. I mean, not new, it's newer.
I own it. The disservice I'm doing myself with what I'm doing now is I'm around the end of the Dark Tower series. So 2/3 of the way through his work, everything he's comes out with, I buy. But because I started this, all those new books that I'd probably read the moment I got them are now sitting at the end of the shelf waiting for me to get to them. So I'm in a way, even though I'm reading everything, I'm almost behind now because I haven't hit the last few years worth of books. So I'm excited to get to some of those, but I haven't touched them yet.
I think I'd love to hear your feedback when you get to it, because it's an interesting, the premise is about kind of a pastor that has weird powers and and a storyline where like it starts when a kid's young and then it fast forwards and when they're old and they kind of come back together, and it's a fascinating story. But I feel like it's kind of the epitome of King. It's like a character that he's done a bunch of times.
Yeah,
I hated the ending, like a lot of his books, but it just kind of left me like, oh really, I think he just was like, I'm done, I'm good, and he just kind of said the end. But it's a really fascinating read, just kind of bringing in some of that good and evil type stuff. So yeah, thanks for sharing that part. And I think when you're thinking about, if you are a writer, you want to be a writer, reading good books, I find myself as I get older and I've written some stuff now, it's you come back to some of these stories and you do see the flaws, you do see, you read it more as a critic sometimes.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think, a research project. I think you can, read widely so you can kind of see the different ways that people tell stories and, and understand they're a product of their time. In their place. I mean, you're not going to get away with 1,000-page book. That's not a thing anymore, unless you're, the guy who writes the Game of Thrones. But
yeah,
it's just not tenable, and it's just not people's attention span anymore. And it's unless you're Stephen King, you just do it anyways. But it could be difficult. So, Jay, when you think about writing, you've shared a lot of obviously hard things when it comes to your own limitations because of your kidneys and medication and all that. But what would you say, just as a craft standpoint? You're a full-time writer. This is your calling, it's your vocation. It's what you do to support your family. What are some other things that you would say are just hard things about writing? Like what makes it difficult? At least for you.
A lot of that swings towards the business side now because it is a career for me. Describing the joy of writing is odd because it's hard to explain. Okay, is it in writing the story? Is it in being done with the story? Is it in going back and figuring out how to make the story work? And And then, of course, I think there's a missing element that a lot of people don't talk about, is that what works for an individual author changes over time. And so the author that has a particular way of doing it, a particular time of day, a particular number of words, I think that's more rare than the author that figures out something works for a couple weeks and then it stops working. And then they have to change, where they work or what time of day they work, or change the way they sleep so that they can work in the morning, or that kind of thing. And then figuring out, okay, I a couple months ago, I was writing, thousands of words a day. I can't do that now. It's getting in the way. What's my word maximum for the day? What can I do? And then that changes again. So I think some of it is sort of embracing your own evolution and figuring out what's next. I'm doing writing oddly now because I moved on to Twitch, and so I write live on Twitch, which is completely alien to the writing process. It is completely wrong, and it's not the way it should be done. But I do it really well. And one thing I do on Twitch that a lot of even the scant number of authors that are on there, it's something I'm able to do that that I haven't seen anyone else able to do, is that while I'm writing a story, I can say it out loud. So it's not just a silent watching me write, which again, when I first did it, I thought it was going to be like an unwatchable piece of performance art. But it turns out that enough people found it interesting that it kind of caught on, and I'm making some progress there. But it does change the way I write. Like my goriest stories aren't going to be on Twitch. That's going to be stuff I have to write off of Twitch. I could probably get away with it, but it's just not. It's not necessarily the thing you do in front of people, kind of thing. So I can still do horror. I can still do stories that have cussing in them. I can still do violence and that kind of thing. But I change the way I do it if it's a Twitch story as opposed to door closed story, which is the way you're supposed to write. So kind of figuring out like this new author platform and what that means and how that changes writing. All of that stuff is difficult. And then from the business side, it's the idea of, okay, I've started this thing new and now I got to build it up from nothing. And then I got to figure out how it fits into everything else I'm doing. And then when this other stuff I was doing works and it's not working anymore, do I figure out how to make it work? Do I keep beating the dead horse? Do I move on to something else? Is it not right to move on to something else because it became hard and stopped working? Does that mean I'm supposed to leave it behind? And then the idea of what works in writing is pretty nebulous because it's difficult to make any money and then make enough money to live off of is this whole different peak that's out of reach for a lot of people starting out and that kind of thing. So my biggest struggles right now often are on the business side. On the writing side, I kind of had to relearn how to write without fear in the first draft, like all the things I've learned about what makes a good story, being able to either just use what sits in the subconscious or being able to push it aside just to get the first draft done. And so to get the first draft done without fear, and then everything that I've learned kind of comes between draft 1 and draft 2. Like I come back and say, okay, I know I have a bad habit of repeating words, so I need to get all that out. And I know I have a bad habit of, especially when I start writing fast, I use the same sentence structure several times in a row, so I got to change that. And then, of course, the normal stuff between first and second and third draft where you got to figure out, okay, I realize I put a theme in here, but it's disconnected. So now I need to go through and connect that theme that makes it look like I knew what I was doing at the beginning. And then kind of figuring out what anchors the story. Like, okay, this story isn't working, and I need to figure out why it's not working. And it's not always obvious. Sometimes it's very, very subtle. Almost always the ending of my stories needs some work. So even when the story is very, very good, usually the ending's not perfect. And a lot of times making it right is subtle and small. And then just any number of other things that you just kind of try to figure out as an author to make the story work. Whereas it's not real cut and dry all the time, especially if you start writing things that you haven't written before.
Mm-hmm. No, those are good. I think you're also digging into, it's funny why I do this podcast is it doesn't matter if you're, again, interesting people doing interesting things, whether you're a writer or, a professor or whatever. A lot of what you're describing is kind of, the evolution of our work, our craft. It's this used to work, this doesn't work. The way I go about, preaching a sermon or write a book or, doing meetings or not doing meetings, or, you're always trying to figure out kind of what works, or, what technology is working or not. I'm curious, just on the Twitch side of things, Twitch is I think mainly like a gaming kind of.
Yes, it's primarily a video game platform. I'm very much off brand by going in there.
Well, I was just gonna say it was a dumb idea, but I didn't want to say that out loud. But no, but what was kind of the impetus to kind of explore just the new way of writing in public? Because I think there's actually a history of people writing in public. I mean,
yeah.
I know some folks that have done that and kind of took the magic in a good way out of writing to say, hey, like, this isn't just a unicorn that falls on our shoulder. Like, watch me do this, and it's painful and whatever. But yeah, tell us a little bit about how'd you kind of figure that out or decide to do that?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of success in writing comes from figuring out what not everyone else has done yet and then doing it first. And then so like at one point that was ebooks, and of course that's saturated now. And at another point it was Patreon and crowdfunding, and that's a hard. It's not out of reach to go in there, but it's a harder step up from what it used to be. And my favorite thing is to find something that not only has not a lot of people gotten into, but even when they see me do it, they can't figure out how I do it. And so it's not going to be a rush in, because there's a steep enough learning curve that I get sort of the playground to myself for a while. It was actually Brian Keene, who I follow on Patreon, who suggested that if he were 10 years younger, he would begin to work on Twitch as an author platform. And so I asked him in the chat, like, if you were 10 years younger and you were doing this, how would you do it? And he basically described it as sort of a more interactive YouTube channel where you're doing Ask Me Anythings, you're doing interviews, you're doing craft type stuff. So I started experimenting with it. And, over time you learn how to make it better, how to do the overlays, and how to do do what they call stream to record. So like it's not, you don't want to take a Twitch stream and move it straight to YouTube. It's not going to work. But if you plan the stream as if you were filming a YouTube video, then you can take it and edit it into something that you can use on the permanent side, which is how you draw traffic into your site and stuff. And again, Twitch gets to a point where you can monetize. And so as I moved along, each time I would learn something a little bit more, and I would improve what I was doing just a little bit more. Not big changes, but just figure out, okay, if I do this, put this in this place, or do it this way, then it's going to be a small percentage better. And so I increased by small percentages. And finally reached the first monetizing level, which is affiliate, and then I've actually started to get subscribers on there. So it's now a monetized platform for me. It's very small compared to like what I make from Patreon or what I make from self-publishing on Amazon and that kind of thing. But it's growing, and so my goal is kind of to make that a primary author platform for me, partly because it feeds up into the other platforms. So the content I create on there, I can move into YouTube. I can use that to enhance my podcast that I already do, and then I can cut clips from that I can use on YouTube and share on my other social media and share on Patreon. And so I was able to justify going into it and spending the money on the equipment and that kind of thing with the idea that even if I never got a single viewer, I could feed all the content that I made up into my other platforms. And I think by doing that, I also drew a funnel down into that platform. So it's very new for me, and there's not really a roadmap that's been done out even by other writers that are on there and more successful than me at this point. But I kind of like that. I think that's the path to success, is figuring out where my uniqueness works and then doing it while the space is not completely saturated. And at some point it will be. It almost inevitably has to be when you're talking about authors. But if I really work at it, I might be at a level where I can sustain income from that before everybody else is in, and that just kind of feeds into the success that I would already have at that point, I guess.
Well, I like the idea of, diversifying your kind of income stream. I think that's important too, just as a writer and creator of anything. I mean, if you're just going to, one time it was, the Amazon gold rush, just everybody just get on Amazon. That's all you need. And then you realize you got to have other, streams. I mean, ebook, print, audio, other platforms, like you can't, YouTube, whatever, like you just have to have, other trickles of income if you're going to make it. No, I like that. And I think that's always the challenge is like, how do you, how can you become first, or how do you get into those spaces? What's it been like, the first time you did it, when you realize like, I'm doing this like in public, I'm writing a story and people are watching, even if it's a small amount of people, I'm reading it out loud as I'm writing. I mean, what did you feel weird? Did you feel exposed? Did you, were you like, is this, terrible? What have you? How did that go?
Well, there's kind of two phases. So early on, I only had my laptop computer with the laptop camera, the laptop microphone. And so I was just going on there. It was one screen, so I couldn't see everything all at once. It was all kind of a mess. And at that point, I was just doing readings, and I edited a story on there as well. Because at that point, the idea of writing on there, it was just alien, and it probably still is. But there was no way I could figure out, okay, I'm just going to sit there and type a story. So that wasn't even in my mind at that point. And then my laptop camera died. And so I even deleted all the software off my computer and stuff. It was just that little laptop, which really didn't have the bandwidth to the processing power to really justify streaming. So it was a very choppy stream and all that. And even though, gaming takes a lot of processing. Right. Just showing myself on camera and showing my screen takes a fraction of that, but it's still not nothing. So you need more oomph in your computer than just your everyday Skype call or whatever. So I went without it for a long time, and then was thinking more and more about it, and just sort of thought, okay, can I justify the expense to buy like a real gaming computer, not top of the line, but it's an actual gaming streaming computer, buy an actual webcam, buy another screen so I can have, my software and everything open off here to the side and show my display in front of me. All these things that go into it. I already had the microphones and stuff from podcasting. And so I kind of made the calculation that I could justify spending the money because it would feed up into other areas. And so the second time coming on with camera and everything was different. It was there was a little more investment into it. And I learned a lot by watching other streamers that did tutorials and that kind of thing. And of course, a lot of it is geared toward gaming. So I kind of had to take what wasn't designed for me and glean what I could from it. But a lot of the wisdom works. The idea of like, you're going to gain followers on Twitch while you're not streaming, the stuff you put off on other platforms. And then the idea that creating content was more important than any of the other stuff you had going on, and refining and editing what content went onto YouTube. So all those kind of learning things from people outside myself sort of helped me hone what I was doing. The first time I wrote on stream, it was an experiment. I did not expect it to become a thing. I was just going to do it. And it oddly worked. And then I did it again when I was sort of doing a tribute to an author friend of mine who had passed. And I was just going to write a short story dedicated to him. And that got a lot of attention. And of course, anything you do, whether it's podcasting or anything else, the more times you do it, the better you get at it. And then that idea of being able to speak out loud while I was typing sort of was my unique way of telling you a story while I was writing it. So you could watch it appear on the screen, you could hear it, which played into everything that was going on. So sort of developing that, developing, I guess, from an experiment to a practice, sort of gave me the opportunity to say, okay, I've defined who I am in this space, and now I can sell that to people who may be willing to invest in it. And so that was kind of the growth that went into it. And I don't think it's completely unlike the experience of other streamers who are primarily doing gaming, which is the focus of the platform and that sort of thing.
So what do you, are these stories, like, do you have a plan for the stories? Like after, I mean, are you planning on like, I'm going to actually, edit them, sell
Yes.
them? It's not just, experimental. If it works, it doesn't,
Sometimes it's experimental.
Okay.
I try to, again, I try to go fearless into a short story. So something that shouldn't work, I'll still try it. And of course, there's some issues in there that I haven't explored deeply yet. Like the fact that I've written it live on stream, I think technically makes it a reprint, no matter where I put it. So I've kind of leaned into that. When I write a story on Twitch, I just go ahead and put it up on YouTube. I go ahead and put it over on Patreon. I use it to promote, and it builds enough fascination. Like it's different enough, and not to, I'm going to toot my own horn a little bit, but even in my first draft, I create a story that's fascinating enough that it draws people's attention. Like it's not perfect, but it's good enough, especially seeing it materialize before your eyes, that people who watch kind of get drawn in. And I think in some cases they're kind of surprised that this short story is just appearing as opposed to just being some slop that people are putting up there. Right. And I'm not talking down on anyone else that's streaming, but I think sometimes I'm putting up a closer to complete piece than a lot of other writers are doing. They'll move up to another point in the story and then move back, and it's kind of an ongoing thing. But creating a short story from beginning to end live before someone's eyes and seeing the beginning, middle, and end form is kind of a fascinating thing, I think, for a lot of people. And like I said, I've just gotten better at it as I go. Sometimes I have nothing but the title. Like I'll just go in, sit down, and I don't know anything about the story other than the title. Now, at the same time, anytime I know I'm going to be writing the story called this, and on the dry erase board you see behind me, I have all my projects up in there, but this scrawled madman kind of bottom right corner is when I hear a phrase or something that sticks with me, I'll write it down there as a potential story title. And a lot of times the story idea will then attach to a title, which I'll then use. But I'll put the title down, I'll advertise that that's what I'm going to write about. And then during the day, kind of the pieces of the story, character names and things like that will come together, and then I'll just write it from the title, just off the top of my head. Other times I do a little more work. Like I found it, if I go ahead and look up some character names and some street names and some town names and stuff like that, it kind of greases the wheels a little bit to where I'm not getting stuck on something like that. But the best ones I've done are the ones I've gone in cold, where essentially I have a title and maybe an idea of what the story will be. And then just like during regular writing, you'll be partway through the story and figure out, I think this is where the story goes. So I'll actually do that live while people are watching. And then of course, there's the pressure that like you have actual eyes on you. So you can't really have that moment where you just kind of sit there and stare at the screen for a minute and a half. So it's kind of like ghostwriting in that way, where I couldn't pause. I had to just drive through the story into the end. And so I think that's where it kind of comes together, and I guess it's the draw of the channel itself, is just that watching the magic and still having it be a little bit of magic, I think.
Well, I imagine there's some kind of accountability almost built in a weird way, that you're trying to actually tell a good story because you're doing it in public. It's not just you in your basement, nobody cares, nobody's watching. Right. But then it's like, actually want to do well at this, it's funny, one of my evolutions, and maybe I hear you saying it, is like you try to write that first draft a little cleaner than in previous times, because I remember when my very first novel, it was such a mess that like I just wanted to just throw up and give up, and because it was almost just too much work to even try to fix the thing. So you realize like there is something to writing better first drafts, where you're actually whether you're outline it or pants it doesn't matter, but actually try to write a good story. Like you're not just going, I'm just going to write some random ideas and just subconsciously see what happens, but really you're saying, hey, this actually is readable. Like you said, it's like, it's not perfect, it's not done yet, but there's something there, right? And I think that's where a lot of writers actually get frustrated, is they give up because they come back to this thing and it's just such a mess and it doesn't make any sense. And they're just like, why am I even doing this? And it kind of almost works against them. But I like the pressure of having like someone that's, watching you and holding you accountable to that. But Jay, I love just the idea of experimenting and trying new things. I think that's really important. I think in all of our work and whatever we're doing, We can get such a rut and just think, oh, this is the way you do it. And, but, just kind of exploring new ideas. Now, when you, this, I think, segues into a lot of what you're writing, short stories, novellas, novels. A Jay Wilburn story. What would you say? Using a few words. What's in there? I mean, I know there's a lot of cussing, a lot of death, but other than that, no. What is you're influenced by King. You have certain subjects you're writing about. What would you say is kind of your thing?
I really don't know, and I would probably know better if I'd written less. So, like, for instance, just like going up from age group, I have a middle grades series that's geared a little younger called Lake Scatterwood, and I originally wrote it for my son, who was struggling as a reader when he was like middle grades age, and was getting to the age where stuff that he could read easily was not written for him. And so it's a middle grades novel, but it's written to be easier to read for like possibly younger readers or struggling readers. So a lot of elementary readers have picked up on that one, even though it's a middle grades novel. And it's just kind of these kids at camp sort of running into monsters. It's campy. There is some light peril, but it's never anything where you actually think that the kids are going to get hurt, really. So I have that series, which is very different from like Vampire Christ, which is, a political satire and a gory vampire story. Then I have a firmly middle grades series called Time Travel Academy. And it's these, kids traveling through time trying to fix things. And so it has, actual history in it, but it's written with an 8th grader that's kind of trapped and having to help time travelers. Then I have a young adult, Maidens of Zombie Kingdom, which has a little bit more gore in it, and it's zombies in sort of a high fantasy sword and sorcery situation. All the characters in it are all the main characters are female, and that one's done pretty well. It's a complete trilogy. And then you get up into my adult stuff like Dead Song, which is an ongoing zombie series, very rough, very vulgar, I would say. Same thing with Vampire Christ. And then you get up into some other books that I've written, especially ones I've teamed up with on with Armand Rosamalia, where we might lean a little bit into crime fiction. We did a haunted house story. The one we have coming out in April is called Room 138, which is sort of a time travel story where the time travelers don't know why they keep moving through time, and they're trying to figure out the mystery of it as they're jumping between times. So almost genre and in some cases style, especially when it comes to age groups, it's very, very different stories. I think I have humor in my stories. If you just put it up to the adult stuff, I think I didn't realize I was writing extreme horror or splatterpunk much until like I was nominated for an award for it. And I didn't realize I was leaning into it. I just thought I was telling a story. And even in some cases, I thought my stuff was pretty mild compared to some of the other authors. And even when I was looking at going to KillerCon, which is sort of the extreme horror splatterpunk convention, I planned to go to it before I was nominated for an award there. And I actually talked to some people. I said, I think I'm a little off brand. Like, I don't know that I'll fit in very well. They're like, no, you're fine. Just come on in. And I didn't realize that they were commenting on my work. Like, I thought they were just saying, no, we'll accept you even though you're not one of us, kind of thing. And then I sort of had to realize that, I do write this sort of stuff. So it's more of sort of, I guess, a storytelling voice. Like, I don't know that I could describe what makes a Jay Wilburn story, but I recognize when I'm telling a story in my voice and when I'm off, like when I don't have the premise yet. And I think it is a little bit of humor. I think it is a little bit of irreverence. I think it's giving the characters some depth. I think that defines what I do a good bit. I think it's trying to nail dialogue, action, and story, like delivering on all three of those. So it's not just like, Jay Wilburn writes good dialogue or he writes good action, just that like all three of those are there so that like if I'm slipping on one or the other, I think I'm still carrying the reader through. I do try to write, like, even as a person of faith, I think people may see that in my stories from time to time, but I tend to steer away from it sometimes. Like, I don't feel like faith doesn't get an automatic invitation in the story. It kind of has to earn its way in.
Sure.
And I think that's the case with a lot of things. I'm more interested, like I feel more successful as an author when I successfully write a character with a viewpoint completely different from mine. Mm-hmm. So if I write that and I write it well and it works on the page, like I feel like I've really done something. So I don't necessarily, while I carry a personal faith, I don't necessarily make my faith the hero of the story. So the person that believes what I believe could still be the villain. And so while I'll even explore some of those, I may be more interested in exploring how an atheist would deal with the situation, or how someone of a different faith or different worldview would navigate through this story, as opposed to how I as a person would navigate through the story.
Yeah. So when you think of, I was actually going to ask you that question as far as a guy of faith, you're thinking about horror, you're thinking about, faith gets in there. If it doesn't, it doesn't. If it's more, overt or just kind of on the sidelines, how does that factor in, just as far as what you are writing, or what, is that a conversation? I mean, as far as, how gritty does it get? How, is there a line I have to draw? Is there no lines?
Right.
Is there, what's kind of your filter, or if you have one, for that, or is that just kind of let the story be what it needs to be?
I definitely want to try to let the story be what it needs to be. I think, again, like everything needs to earn its way in. It doesn't get invited. So I'll write extreme horror and gore, but it has to earn its way in. Mm-hmm. Like if showing the viscera of a gunshot wound is just self-indulgence and not really working for the story, I might not do it. Like it may be more powerful to have the narrative character turned away while it's happening, so they're only seeing, hints and noise and the periphery of what's going on, as opposed to just watching it happen and describing it in medical detail. Mm-hmm. So even in the stories where I'll write horror, like sometimes it's interesting to have the character's emotions be what the scene's about, and sort of the extras, like some of it's almost off camera, and then what's on camera is hints and teases. Mm-hmm. So I'll sometimes do that because it's a more powerful way to tell it. Mm-hmm. I'll do stories about faith and about God and about church and everything else. But a lot of times, even with that, I'm like, okay, what hasn't been done? What have I never seen before? Mm-hmm. And that, of course, that list gets smaller and smaller and more minute the way you go, and the stories get stranger and stranger. Mm-hmm. So I like to explore God. I've started to figure out that what attracts me to horror is also kind of what connects me to the Bible. So when I hear the crucifixion described, I see a horror story. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of gets watered down a lot, mm-hmm. Particularly in certain denominations, but I think Christianity broadly, where we got, Jesus like dying in the most excruciating way ever designed by humanity. We need to design that story so it fits in a pastel Bible for children. Mm-hmm. And it's not quite that. And actually the word excruciating comes from crucifixion. Like it's the word originally meant the pain you would feel upon a cross. Mm-hmm. And so we even water down that word, where we'll describe things as excruciating that aren't as extreme as a crucifixion. Mm-hmm. And so that idea of things being paid for in blood, and like the stories that get skipped in the Sunday school quarterlies, like the violence and the chopping people into pieces and all these things that are literally in the Bible that we won't talk about in Sunday school. These are horror stories. And then just the very nature of God himself, like the fact you can't say his real name, you can't look at his face and survive. You can't, like Moses has to see him when he's passing by, so you're getting a glimpse. Mm-hmm. All of that is cosmic horror. Like that's the unknowable thing. And it's fascinating to deal with God on the idea of like there's only so much we as human beings can know about him, even though our calling is to know him. Mm-hmm. That there's a limit to what we can know, like what our minds can comprehend, what our own bias will let us realize about God, the things we don't like to know, the things we don't want to face about him, the things we don't want to face in ourselves. Mm-hmm. All of that is really powerful story that a lot of people of faith, and especially writing of faith, just doesn't want to dive into, because there's not a lot of room for ambiguity. There's not a lot of room for the number of characters that have gotten angry with God in the Bible and have still been described as after God's own heart is countless. And so we when we talk about David and when we talk about Paul, and we talk about Peter and all these characters, a number of these characters do some pretty gnarly stuff. I mean, you could argue that St. Paul was a serial killer before he was a mass murderer before he became a Christian. And of course, we touch on it, but we kind of gloss over it. The fact that the doors open for these ne'er-do-wells. And so again, like when I write anything of faith, when I explore who God is, that's the more interesting bit for me, because it's the part that we avoid. It's the element of God that we won't look him in his face about, but we'll kind of glimpse out from the cleft of the rock. And the stories that we don't really understand why they're in the Bible, I find extremely fascinating. If you believe God is who the Bible says he is, then the story we don't understand, the story that doesn't seem to fit, probably tells us more about God than we realize. Like one of my favorites, I know I'm going on a tangent here a little bit, but like one of my favorite stories from the Bible, one of my favorite parables is the dishonest manager, because it's the wrong character. Like the hero of the story is completely wrong. So basically that story is a parable about a guy that's sort of not been a good manager, and the master's about to fire him. So the guy goes completely dishonest. He goes around and starts forgiving everybody's debts behind his master's back, and starts using money to kind of set himself a landing place after he gets fired for cause, essentially. And then the master says, that was shrewd. I'm going to praise this guy for basically sinning. And so you look at that story and you're like, I don't understand what God's getting at there. But the idea is that like we're all the dishonest manager. Like we're all like God has picked a bunch of screw ups to bring his will about, and that's us. We're the bad managers that he's chosen to run our show. And he's describing all of us, and you can match it up to other parables about 11th hour. Like we basically go through our lives not doing right. Even after we're Christians, even after we're serving God, we're doing a terrible job of it. And then at the last moment, when we realize our time's almost up, we suddenly get serious about him. We suddenly start like trying to work out what's going to happen in the afterlife. We start trying to do something with our lives. And then God says, great, it's about time. And so like we don't understand the dishonest manager, because we don't want to realize that that's who we are. That like we're all on borrowed time right now. But until we see the pink slip coming, until it's cancer, until we don't breathe real well, until suddenly our friends around us start dying and we realize, oh, we're getting old. That's the moment that we start making accounts right. We start being having more grace. We start cutting debts. We start doing all those things that we should have been doing from hour one. I love those kind of stories because people don't get them. Like they're so antithetical to what we think Christianity should be. And like all the answers about faith are in there. They're in the part that we don't want to read. We don't want to think about, that doesn't work in the pastel version of the Bible. And so when I write a horror story, I'm looking for that uncomfortable bit. And especially when I explore God, I want to explore the God of the book of Job that we really don't like. We don't like that guy that makes bets with the devil over how much we can take. Like that's not the God we want to deal with. And looking at the God that would deal with someone like David, like David's one of the most bloody, unredeemable characters in the Bible, and God redeems him anyway. And so we look at David as sort of this figure that's after God's own heart, but we don't realize that going after God's own heart includes all this other stuff that we don't like to talk about with David. So I'm not sure how well my horror lands with a solid Christian audience, just because I like the pieces of the Bible that we don't like to talk about, I think.
Well, and I always joke, it's like the Bible's, our